1 in every 17 people in America, about 13.6 million total, suffer from a major serious mental illness. America recognized the needs of the mentally ill when the first mental asylum was opened. However, despite the original good intentions, this became a nightmare. Workers who were in charge of bringing people in started to bring in whoever, even if they weren't insane, because they were paid by the amount of people that they brought in. This drove mentally stable people to become insane. A lot of mental hospitals are now thought to be haunted due to the cruel treatment of its patients in the asylums while they were open. The asylums were horrible and had inhumane conditions. Asylums that were meant for 250 people had 2,400 people in them. Patients were left to freeze to death in their beds. Restraints were placed on all of the beds. Lobotomies were performed with tools such as ice picks. Patients were neglected and roamed around without clothing and were malnourished. In some of the hospitals, there were full-scale lobotomies, straitjackets, shock therapy, insulin shock therapy, which was meant to send the patients into a coma, and even worse. Charlie Lord compared the Byberry Mental Hospital to a Nazi concentration camp because of how the so-called patients were treated. In the courses of the worst asylums, proof was needed in order to expose them. There were many reporters that went in to investigate it. There was Julius Chambers, who in 1872 was committed to the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum with the help of the senior editor of the New York Tribune in order to show the true side of these institutions. He later published a story talking about what happened, including patients that were choked and kicked until they bled, and the horrors of the asylum that led to many suicides. There was also Bill Baldini's Suffer the Little Children, an expose on the Pennhurst Insane Asylum. It showed the horrible conditions of this asylum, including the screaming, the sexual and physical abuse, and the lack of empathy towards their own patients. A kid who bit another person was given one warning, but if a second offense occurred, all of their teeth were pulled. Though both of these shone a light on how truly terrible these hospitals were, the most influential story was that of Elizabeth Cochran, whose pen name was Nellie Bly. Bly, after struggling to start up a career as a woman journalist, which at the time was unheard of, went undercover into the Blackwell Lunatic Asylum. She pretended to be a mentally insane woman and got sent to the asylum for 10 days so she could then later show the truth of the asylums to the public through journalism. The asylums were horrible. She was crammed into a room where rats littered the floor and guards refused water and food, and also physically abused the patients. After Bly was released, she wrote a series of articles that made people question the truth of the asylums and if the asylums should be banned altogether. Now, this is only the history of the mental asylums in America. Many other locations have done similar things and tried to ignore the actuality of the severity of mental health. Today, I have chosen to focus on the mental health problems in Asia and how they are dealt with, specifically in China. The mental health law was passed in China on May 1st, 2013, which was a game-changing move. Before this law, similar things were happening in China as they did in the US, where certain people that did not have mental health issues were deemed mentally unstable and were sent to a mental hospital against their will, from both good and bad intents from the people who sent them. On July 5th, 2013, 42 psychiatric patients escaped from the People's Hospital in Tang County. But that didn't end the chaos. Only 12 days later, a knife wielder who had a mental illness during rush hour killed 2 people while they were shopping. Since 2009, 100 million Chinese people have suffered from mental health problems. This means that 1 in every 13 people had a mental health problem, when back in 1950, the ratio was 1 in 37. According to Fan Bioli, the Chinese society has exhibited discrimination against them being mentally ill, making their reintegration harder. In China, one of the biggest problems is that because of this, people refuse to admit to mental health issues. Wu Yuanhong, whom had schizophrenia, was forced to live in a small metal cage for 11 years by his mother after he beat a boy to death. Instead of admit that their son had done a horrible thing and that he had a mental illness, he was shackled and put in a metal cage because they were afraid that others would find out about it and judge them for it. The saddest part of this is that in China, that's not unusual. There are many reports of random attacks, killings, and suicides due to this. A 27-year-old factory worker tried to kill themselves by jumping into a cage of Bengal tigers and attempting to feed themselves to them. There was also a man who had schizophrenia that killed 6 people with an axe. Things like suicidal tendencies are treated as someone sane trying to find justice, and not treated as a psychiatric problem. In fact, police officials, not medical evidence or psychiatrics, were the ones who declared them insane. People who were probably sane were proclaimed ill and shipped off to the St. Joseph's Hospice, which was similar to an asylum, and the numbers soon outweighed the number of sick beds and nurses, making the rooms crowded and uncomfortable. People sent their own children and wives to this asylum that was practically a jail on false pretenses because no one ever heard what the person who was actually being sent away had to say. The asylum didn't even employ any medically trained personnel. It was solely established to show social security, but it wasn't really helping anyone, and even if it did, it was balanced out by the horrible things they did. In the end, they chose to do mental selections on days like National Day China so that they would keep up their popularity by showing people they were trying to protect them. In Zhangjiao, 2% of the population, which is over 1,000 people, were diagnosed with severe mental issues. Another huge problem with this, though, is that there is 20,000 psychiatrics, because mental illness is treated as such a bad thing in Chinese culture, for 173 million people. This means that for every 100,000 mentally ill people, there are 1.5 psychiatrics. There is just too many to be able to help them all with the disdain that China treats mental illness with. On top of this, there are many reasons why people don't seek help for their mental illnesses, including costs, not knowing that they suffer from a mental illness, no locally available mental health services, and fear that even if they do seek help, they will not get better, and more. Mental health is a serious issue that takes place all around the world.